Snow fell gently until blood marked the white. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me your city. I value your voices. Wolfe begins his winter case. If you want to know how to ruin a perfectly good December morning, let me recommend interrupting Nero Wolfe in the middle of his orchid session. I've done it before, but always with a reasonable excuse, like homicide or a woman on the brink of hysteria. This time, I was innocent. The blame belonged to a woman in a green hat with a sprig of mistletoe pinned to the brim, standing at our front door and refusing to state her business to me, except that it was personal, urgent, and not suitable for the telephone. That's the kind of statement that gives me hives. She looked expensive. Tailored coat, fur collar, a perfume that cost more than a week's groceries, and eyes sharp enough to slice prosciutto. When a woman like that refuses to explain herself, you can bet the explanation involves money, lies, or both. "I'll tell Mr. Wolfe directly," she said. "It concerns a private matter." "Lady," I told her, "around here, private matters are like snowflakes. Everybody swears theirs is unique, but the rule stands. I get the preview, or you don't make the show." Her chin went up half an inch. "Then tell Mr. Wolfe that Marian Follis is here, and that she's come about his Christmas party." That was new. Wolfe and Christmas parties go together like champagne and castor oil. Still, she said it with enough confidence that I figured she wasn't lost. I left her in the front room, still smelling faintly of frost and French perfume, and climbed up to the plant rooms. Wolfe was among his orchids, sleeves rolled, eyes half shut, murmuring Latin to something that looked like it might bloom in the next century. Fritz was hovering with the misting can like a priest with holy water. "Boss," I said. "Visitor, female, ornamental. Name of Marian Follis. Says it's about your Christmas party." That got a reaction. Wolfe's eyebrows lifted, barely but noticeably. "Puis, I do not give parties, least of all during that infernal season." "That's what I told myself. She seems to think you do." He grunted. "Follis. The name is not unfamiliar." "Maybe it should be. Do I tell her to go deck somebody else's halls?" "Bring her down," he said. "And Archie, see that she removes that ridiculous hat. I will not be stared at by mistletoe." By the time we got to the office, she'd taken the hat off, but kept the poise. Wolfe was in his chair, settled like a mountain waiting for weather. She gave him a look that suggested they'd met before, not under pleasant circumstances. "Mr. Wolfe," she began. "This is an intrusion, I know, but I had no choice. Something terrible has happened, and your name is involved." Wolfe's eyes closed halfway, the way they do when he's testing whether the world is worth engaging. "My name?" he repeated. "Yes." Her voice shook slightly. "A man was murdered last night, in my home, and before he died he said he was delivering your Christmas gift." That got Wolfe's full attention. He sat up half an inch straighter. I waited for him to ask the obvious question, but instead he just studied her as if she were a specimen under glass. Finally he said, "Madame, I have not in all my years exchanged gifts, least of all through intermediaries who expire in the attempt. You will oblige me with particulars." She took a breath, clasped her hands. "The man's name was Alton Bryce. He worked in antiques, rare books, documents. He came to dinner last night at my apartment, uninvited but not unwelcome. I'd known him for years. After dinner, he told me he had something for you, something you'd appreciate. Then he went into my study, and minutes later, I found him there. Dead, strangled with a ribbon of mistletoe." Even Wolfe's eyebrows couldn't keep their composure at that one. I whistled. "Festive." Wolfe didn't answer. His eyes were on her, deep and unreadable. "And why, Mrs. Follis? Would this Bryce imagine that a gift from him would interest me?" "That's just it," she said. "He said it wasn't from him. He said it came from your house." That landed like a stone in a still pond. Wolfe didn't move. Fritz froze in the hall doorway. I felt the temperature drop a degree. Wolfe spoke finally, very quietly. Archie. Yes, sir. Kindly examine the premises. Every room, every drawer. See if anything is missing. He turned to Mrs. Follis. You may rest here a moment. You've brought the stench of death into my home. I shall not add discourtesy. She sank into a chair. Wolfe leaned back, eyes shut again, hands folded on his stomach, looking for all the world as though he'd drifted back into indifference. But I knew better. If something had gone missing from the brownstone and wound up wrapped in murder and mistletoe, then the great Nero Wolfe was about to spend his Christmas not with orchids or beer, but with homicide. And that, as Fritz would say, was a recipe for indigestion. I started with the office, because if anything had slunk off with something of Wolfe's, it would have passed through there like a cat through a fish market. His desk was as he'd left it. Pens aligned like soldiers on inspection, the dictionary sunflowering at a page from yesterday's crossword assist. Blotter immaculate. The safe was locked, the key sleeping in its saucer on the side table, and the cabinet where we keep case notes looked undisturbed, which doesn't prove anything except that burglars have manners these days. I made a tour that would have satisfied a real estate agent and a skeptical aunt. Front room, dining room, kitchen. I got Fritz's wince when I opened a jar to sniff cloves and shut it again. Upstairs, my room, the guest room, the bathrooms, the hall closet that holds enough old coats to disguise a small army. The plant rooms I only glanced into because I respect orchids the way I respect loaded firearms. Nothing looked rifled, scratched, tipped, or even breathed on too heavily. If a trespass had happened, it wore velvet gloves and had the decency to clean up. I came back to the office where Marian Follis sat with her hands neatly nested, a woman steadying herself on etiquette. Wolfe hadn't moved farther than to nudge his chair a shade to the left so the winter light wouldn't needle his eyes. Inventory complete? He asked. If anything is missing, I said. It knew better than to leave footprints. Nothing obvious gone, nothing obvious touched. Fritz will corroborate as soon as he stops twitching about the clove jar. Her eyes flicked to me. He said it came from here. Wolfe's lids dipped. Who said precisely? Repeat the phrasing. She obeyed. A gift for Nero Wolfe from his house, he said. Then he smiled, tauntingly, and went into my study. I gave him a minute to collect whatever pageantry he had in mind. When I followed, he was on the rug. The mistletoe ribbon was looped twice. There was no noise, no struggle. No police, Mrs. Follis? I asked. Of course the police, she said, but only after I called you. That, Wolfe murmured, explains our forthcoming guests. The bells sounded in agreement. I didn't need to check the peephole to know I'd be opening for Inspector Kramer with Sergeant Stebbins drafted as sled dog. I let them in. Kramer's hat looked as if it had been put on with an oath. Stebbins's ears were red enough to toast bread. Kramer smelled the room like a hound and fastened on Mrs. Follis, then on Wolfe. So he got himself a Christmas present, he said to the air. The card reads Merry Murder. Good morning, Inspector, Wolfe said. You are unseasonably early. I'm right on time for a homicide that name-drops you like a press agent, Kramer snapped, removing the hat and keeping the bite. Alton Bryce, dead at 9:35 last night by the ME's watch in the East 60s. Hostess, Mrs. Marian Follis. Guests, a professor, a pianist, a publicist, and a property manager. Plus the deceased, who said he had something for you. You want to tell me why my morning starts in your office? Wolfe folded his hands. No. Kramer's jaw played seesaw. Experience told him it was a waste of calories to rage. He re-aimed at Mrs. Follis. You called him why? You thought Nero Wolfe doubles as Santa Claus. She kept her chin up. Because Mr. Bryce used Mr. Wolfe's name as a lure. Because I thought he might know what that meant. Because I would prefer my home not be the nucleus of gossip. She paused. And because I wanted this settled. Settled how? Kramer asked. By logic, she said softly. That was a line to warm Wolfe, where beer could not. He inclined his head as if she'd passed an exam he hadn't admitted he was giving. Inspector, he said, your presence is an affront to my schedule, but not to my reason. Mrs. Follis will recount for you for the record. Archie will record it. In exchange, you will refrain from insinuating that the mention of my name supplies motive or method. Kramer grunted. I'll refrain from insinuating anything until I've got facts to insult. Get on with it. She did. A neat summary with no embroidery. A small dinner to smooth a frayed business alliance. An uninvited Bryce, slick as lacquer, charming enough to be forgiven. A toast, a little Chopin from the pianist. Then the announcement of a gift for Mr. Wolfe, the study, the silent minutes, the body. No signs of forced entry, no one seen leaving. A ribbon of mistletoe plucked from the hat she now gripped. She didn't cry. If she was the kind that cried, she did it the night before where it wouldn't smudge her morning. Names, Wolfe said when she finished. Dr. Harold Cohn, she said. He teaches history of printing at Columbia. Loretta Vale, the pianist, plays at my husband's gallery openings. She paused a fraction on husband. Denton Rain, publicist, mine sometimes, and Mrs. Zella Cogan. She manages the building. Your husband, Wolfe said. Present? No, we're separated. He was in Miami. He returned this morning. Kramer scribbled as if the pencil had offended him. And the deceased, Bryce, dealt in rare books and documents. Yes. Anything to do with you and rare books? He asked Wolfe. Only that I prefer them to be rare by merit, not by misplacement, Wolfe said. It was my cue. We've got a squeaky clean house, I told Kramer. If Bryce lugged something out of here, he didn't leave a ripple. Maybe he didn't lug it, Kramer said. Maybe he mailed it or copied it, or just said he did because he liked hearing his voice. Either way, he's dead on a rug and your boss's name is hanging on the tree. Wolfe made a small sound of distaste. Archie. Right. He squinted at me. Call Mrs. Follis's husband. Then call Mr. Saul Panzer and ask him to look at Alton Bryce. Associates, recent jobs, where he supped and with whom. Also, locate Mr. Bryce's premises. We will require a ledger or the absence of one. Mrs. Follis, you will remain available. Inspector, you will do me the courtesy of not arresting my client before I know whether she is one. Kramer snorted. She isn't your client. She is, Wolfe said, at the instant she asks to be. Marian Follis turned to him. Mr. Wolfe, will you take this? She reached into her bag and drew out a checkbook. Not to protect me, if I'm at risk, but to protect your name, and because I think the gift was real. Wolfe's eyes warmed by a degree. He didn't nod. He didn't have to. Archie, he said, the customary retainer. I took the book, wrote a number that would keep Fritz in Veal and Wolfe in patience, and she signed without flinching. Kramer slapped his hat back on. I'll be in touch, not because I enjoy your company, he said, stomping to the door. Goodwin, if you're going to snoop, don't trip over my men. Inspector, I said, you wound me. I only trip over amateurs. The door closed on January and December. Wolfe breathed deep and slow as if he'd been measuring the room since she'd walked in. Archie, he said, you will start with Mr. Follis. Then you will go to Mrs. Follis's apartment. Look, smell, listen. Something originated here, so it will leave an echo there. Do not touch the mistletoe. I wouldn't dream of it, I said. I like my holidays undecorated. Phooey. Holidays, he murmured. We will have none until this is understood. Which, translated from Wolfe, meant our quiet season had been officially cancelled. When I called Mr. Follis, He was already back from Miami and acting like the weather report had been personally rude to him. His voice came across the line, smooth and deliberate, the kind of tone a man uses when he wants you to know he's got better places to be. I told him I was acting on behalf of his wife, though not for marriage counseling, and that she'd like him to meet me in her apartment within the hour. There was a long pause before he said, "I don't think she'd like anything of the sort," and hung up. I reported that to Wolfe, who only grunted. That meant proceed anyway. So I did. It was a short cab ride to the Foley's place, a polished limestone building with a doorman who probably checked bloodlines along with visitor IDs. He gave me a look that said he'd heard enough gossip to fill a novel, but wasn't sharing the first paragraph. I told him who I was and that Mrs. Follis was expecting me. He picked up the phone, murmured something, then nodded toward the elevator. The apartment smelled faintly of wood polish, orange peel, and trouble. Marion met me at the door, wearing a grey dress that was too calm for someone recently touched by murder. Her movements were steady, but her voice had that brittle edge that comes when a person's been keeping control for too long. "Inspector Kramer's men were here until dawn," she said as I entered. "They took statements, photographs, and the ribbon. I don't know what else they took." "Probably your peace of mind," I said. "Mind if I look around before Mr. Follis arrives?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, of course. Though you won't find anything. Bryce brought the danger with him." "Maybe," I said. "But sometimes danger leaves a forwarding address." The study was medium-sized, lined with books that had more leather than a saddle shop. A mahogany desk sat near the window, neat except for a pale rectangle where a book or box had been recently removed. I pointed to it. "This where he was found?" She nodded. "He was sitting there, slumped. The mistletoe was on the floor. There was a tumbler near his hand. He'd been drinking brandy." I looked closer. "One glass or two?" "Two," she said quietly. "One was mine." That put her at the scene hands-on. She didn't flinch under it, which told me either she was innocent or trained in stage presence. The rest of the apartment told its own story, everything tidy, perfectly arranged. Only the smallest dissonance. A chair turned slightly off its mark, a faint scuff on the parquet near the hall. Not enough for a jury, but Wolfe would notice. When the doorbell rang, Marion drew in a breath and went to answer it. I stayed in the study doorway and got my first look at Jerome Follis. Tall, tanned, impeccably casual, in a way that costs more than most formal wear. He had the air of a man who expected rooms to make room. His eyes went from his wife to me, then narrowed with the polite contempt of a man guessing I worked for her divorce lawyer. "So you're Wolfe's man," he said. "I've read about you. You snoop." "Professionally," I said. "How was Miami?" "Warmer than this circus. My wife seems to have lost her sense of proportion." "She lost a dinner guest to a murder weapon decorated for Christmas. That would throw off anyone's sense of proportion." He stepped farther into the room, scanning it like a man inspecting property he used to own. "I told her Bryce was a fraud," he said, "always sniffing after old letters, manuscripts, anything he could turn for cash. He once tried to sell me a first edition of Poe that turned out to have been stolen from a dealer in London." "Did he succeed?" I asked. Follis smiled without humor. "No, I do my research." "Would you say your wife knew Bryce well?" "Too well to trust him," he said, then caught himself. They'd known each other professionally. He tried to involve her in some ridiculous scheme about cataloging private collections. And yet he showed up at dinner. "I didn't plan the guest list." His tone chilled the air. "But I warned her. Some men bring more than charm to a table." Marion stood by the window, her back straight. "If you're suggesting I invited Bryce for his charm, Jerome, you're wasting breath." "I'm suggesting," he said, "that you've always had a weakness for danger you can pretend is culture." That was my cue to step between them, conversationally if not physically. Let's hold the marital crossfire until the bodies stop dropping, huh? Mr. Follis, did Bryce ever mention Wolfe to you? He frowned. Never. Why would he? Because according to your wife, he died saying he brought something from Wolfe's house. The man froze. Not dramatically, but like a door locking from the inside. That's impossible. People keep saying that, I said. I keep writing it down. Marion turned. Do you have any idea what he meant, Jerome? His eyes flicked to hers, then to me. No, none. But it wasn't the word that caught my ear. It was the timing, too crisp, too prepared. He'd known it would be asked. When he left 10 minutes later, slamming the door just soft enough to be called civilized, Marion sat on the sofa and pressed her temples. He's lying about something, she said. But I don't know what. Neither do I said. Yet. Back in the cab, I called Saul Panzer. His voice came calm, precise, like a good compass in a storm. I gave him the rundown. He promised to start with Bryce's shop, check clients, associates, and whoever might have sold him mistletoe by the yard. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already waiting, an open ledger on his lap. He didn't look up when I walked in. Well, he said. Bryce had a past full of book dust and shady transactions. Marion's clean so far, her husband's not. He knew something, pretended he didn't. And there's a blank spot on her study desk about the size of a rare book. That got a flicker from Wolfe's eyes. A blank spot. Excellent. You noticed. I make a living noticing. You think he took something from here and sold it? I think, Wolfe said, closing the ledger with a sigh, that a man like Bryce would steal significance before he stole silver. Something from this house gained him leverage, or death. We must learn which. He rang for Fritz. Beer, please. 2 bottles. Archie, when Saul reports, we will convene. For now, no visitors, no interruptions. As the beer arrived, Wolfe lifted his glass slightly toward me. You see, Archie, the mischief of Christmas. People insist on giving what no one asked for. Like murder? I asked. Worse, he said. Like sentiment. The next morning started grey, the kind of New York grey that feels permanent until noon proves otherwise. Fritz was humming O Tannenbaum in German while polishing the silver, which didn't help my mood. Wolfe was already in the office, squarely positioned behind his desk, a man braced for siege. I could tell from the tilt of his head that he'd been up earlier than usual, which for him means anything before 10, and that his mind had already dissected the problem into bite-sized intellectual morsels. He looked up as I entered. Saul telephoned, he said. His preliminary findings are informative. Inform me, then, I said, pouring myself coffee. Alton Bryce maintained a small office above a stationery shop on 47th Street. He had recently completed an appraisal for a private collector, Jerome Follis. I stopped stirring. The husband? Just so. 2 months ago, Bryce authenticated several manuscripts for Mr. Follis. Letters attributed to the 18th century. The appraisal was generous. Mr. Follis sold the collection last week to a dealer in Chicago. I let out a low whistle. And if Bryce's appraisal was a fake, that means Follis unloaded counterfeit goods at top dollar. That's a motive with velvet trim. Possibly, Wolfe said, though I'm not yet satisfied. Bryce's death achieved nothing for Follis if exposure were imminent, unless the exposure involved more than the documents. Such as his wife, I said. He gave me a glance that would have frozen soup. Archie, the habits of gossip are the death of reason. However, and here he lifted a finger, Bryce's statement about a gift from my house remains unaccounted for. That is intolerable. That last word came out in a tone that meant work for me. I called Saul and told him to meet me at Bryce's office. The stationery shop smelled of dust, ink, and resignation. The clerk upstairs pointed to a door with Bryce's name painted in gold that had long since faded to copper. Inside, Saul was already at a desk, methodical as a surgeon. "Morning, Archie," he said. "Our boy kept bad company. He was behind on rent and ahead on IOUs. But get this, he had an appointment book with coded initials. I've cracked 3 of them already. AIM-F, Marion Follis. 2 meetings in November, then JF, Jerome Follis. 1 meeting 3 days before he died." I nodded slowly. So he met both spouses, separately, right before Christmas. He must have thought he was playing Santa Claus. Saul handed me a folded sheet of paper. "Also found this in a locked drawer. Typewritten letter, unsigned. It says, 'Your request will be fulfilled when I have assurance the source is secured. The brownstone must not know.' Sound familiar?" "Too familiar," I said. He was talking about Wolfe's place. That makes him stupid or desperate. Saul's eyes narrowed. Desperate. There's no sign of a break-in here, but someone searched this room before the cops did. Drawer locks pried, papers shuffled. Whoever did it was looking for something they didn't find. Or something they already took, I said. "Thanks, Saul. Keep your radar on the Follises. I'll brief the big man." By the time I got back, Wolfe was at lunch. Oxtail stew, bread, and a frown. I reported everything between courses. He listened without interruption, spoon moving with slow precision, as if each detail flavored the broth. When I finished, he put down the spoon and leaned back. "So, Bryce engaged with both Follises and mentioned this house as a source of interest. It follows that one of them, or both, believed something here was of value." "Meaning we've been picked for a secret Santa," I said. He gave me a withering look. "Pfui. Meaning Bryce thought he could appropriate something from me. An item of knowledge, perhaps, or a document. Do you recall, last month, the inquiry from the auction house regarding a manuscript of Benjamin Franklin's correspondence? Sure, you told them to go roast chestnuts. Indeed, a collector offered me a substantial price for verification of a letter, allegedly in Franklin's hand. I declined to examine it. But if Bryce learned of that inquiry and somehow obtained a forged sample, he could use my name to enhance its legitimacy. And then get himself killed for it, I said. Precisely. Wolfe's eyes gleamed faintly. However, the nexus of the crime remains at the Follies' apartment. We shall invite a guest. He reached for the phone and dictated a brief, chilly message to Marion Follis, requesting her presence that evening. When he hung up, he looked at me. "Archie, while she travels here, you will call Dr. Harold Cohn, Loretta Vale, and Mrs. Zella Cogan, the remaining dinner guests. Inform them that I require brief interviews tomorrow morning concerning the death of Alton Bryce." "That'll make their day," I said. "You think one of them did the strangling?" "I think one of them will attempt to lie to me," he said. "And that will suffice." Marion arrived at 7, pale but composed. Fritz took her coat and hat. The mistletoe had been replaced with a plain pin. Wolfe greeted her with a short nod. "You received my message," he said. "Yes," she said softly. "Inspector Kramer told me you'd begun looking into Alton's business affairs." "Regrettably," Wolfe said, "they have begun looking into mine. I prefer symmetry. Mrs. Follis, you met Bryce twice in November. What did you discuss?" "An appraisal," she said. "He claimed to have found a series of 18th-century pamphlets written by Franklin's contemporaries. He wanted me to catalogue them for a gallery exhibit. I refused. Something about him seemed unsteady." "Did he mention a manuscript? Or my name?" She shook her head. "Not directly, but at dinner before he died. He said he had a gift for you, a letter that would restore your faith in reason." It sounded like nonsense. I thought he was mocking me. Wolfe's eyes closed. "Madam, few men mock me and live long. This one, alas, was interrupted." Her lips parted in alarm, but he waved it away. You are dismissed for the evening. Mr. Goodwin will see you to your car." As I walked her out, she said quietly, "He knows more than he tells, doesn't he?" "Always," I said. "And if I were you, I'd keep an eye on your husband. He looks better in sunlight than in truth." She smiled faintly, then disappeared into the night. When I got back upstairs, Wolfe was staring into space, fingertips pressed together. "Archie," he said without looking up. "The mistletoe ribbon. Green silk, yes?" "Right. There is such ribbon in the orchid rooms. It was missing a spool last week." That hit like a crack of thunder in December silence. "Then, boss," I said, slowly, "whatever Bryce took from here, he left something else behind." "Exactly," Wolfe murmured. "We have been trespassed upon." The word trespassed lingered in the air the way cigar smoke does, thin, acrid, and impossible to ignore. I waited, because when Wolfe starts talking about intrusions into the brownstone, he treats it like an act of war. He didn't move at first. His eyes were half shut, his lips barely parted, as though the next words needed to be exact before they escaped. Finally, he said, "Archie, you will not sleep until every room is examined again. Someone entered this house without my consent, and I will not have it reduced to a thoroughfare for thieves or fools." I didn't argue. When Wolfe talks about the sanctity of his home, it's like quoting scripture. You listen or you get smote. I started with the obvious. The plant rooms, where the missing ribbon had lived, were immaculate as usual. Fritz tends them like they're small green children. The shelves were lined with jars of soil samples, sprays, cloths, and the meticulous clutter of Wolfe's quiet obsession. I found the spool tray, 6 rolls of silk ribbon, all accounted for except the one in question. The empty space was as clear as an accusation. I brought the tray downstairs. Wolfe was still in his chair, fingers templed, eyes sharp now. "You've confirmed it?" "Gone," I said. "One spool. Green silk. Same as the ribbon Kramer says Bryce was strangled with." He nodded once. "Then the connection between Bryce and this house is no longer conjecture. Someone came here, Archie, and removed that ribbon for purpose." "Could have been Bryce himself," I said. "He had the nerve to name-drop you while dying. Maybe he had the gall to drop in beforehand." "Unlikely. Bryce was an opportunist, not a fool. Breaking into my house is a singularly foolish act." "Then someone else did it for him," I said. "And that someone may still be walking around free with a key to the front door." Wolfe made a sound like an irritated growl. "The locks are changed every spring. No one possesses that key but you, me, and Fritz. Therefore, the intrusion occurred by artifice, not authorization." He rang for Fritz, who appeared instantly, as if he'd been waiting behind the door all along. "Fritz," Wolfe said, "has anyone entered this house in the past week whom you did not recognize or expect?" Fritz's expression could have earned him a place in any church mural of saints. "No, sir. Delivery men, perhaps, but always under my eye. The only visitor of note was the gentleman from the bookbinder's, bringing the restored volume you purchased." Wolfe's head turned sharply. "When?" "4 days ago, sir. Sirs, describe him." "A young man, perhaps 30. Brown hair, spectacles, polite. He wore gloves," he said to avoid smudging the binding. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Pfui," he said softly. "Gloves? And you allowed him upstairs?" "Only to the library, sir. He left within 5 minutes." "Archie," Wolfe said, "retrieve the book." I went to the library, where the object in question, a restored 18th century folio of travel essays, sat on the shelf, inconspicuous and smug. I carried it back. Wolfe didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned it over in his hands, as though listening to what it wasn't saying. Then he passed it to me. "Observe." I flipped through the pages. At first, nothing unusual. Crisp paper, careful binding, Wolfe's neat ownership plate. but toward the middle, a slip of paper had been pressed so flat it might have gone unnoticed. I eased it out. It wasn't paper. It was parchment, older, brittle, and covered in handwriting so faint it could have been smoke. English, I said. Maybe 18th century. No signature. Read it, Wolfe ordered. It wasn't long. Truth preserved is fortune secured. The debt is settled when the name is revealed. I looked up. Sounds like the world's worst Christmas card. Or the world's most deliberate warning, Wolfe said. Bryce spoke of a gift from my house. This, evidently, is what he meant. You think he found that parchment here? I think, Wolfe said, that Bryce was in league with whoever secreted it there. They used my reputation to authenticate their fraud. But the parchment's wording suggests a debt. And debts, Archie, are what get men strangled. The bell rang, sharp and unwelcome. I went to the door. Inspector Kramer stood there, looking as if the cold had bitten him, but he'd bitten back harder. I heard you found something, he said, stepping inside without invitation. You could have saved me the trouble of guessing. Good evening, Inspector, Wolfe said smoothly. We have made progress. Bryce's connection to this house has now been established. Kramer's eyebrows did a dance. Meaning what? Meaning, Wolfe said, that a certain document, an item of historical interest, was tampered with by someone masquerading as a tradesman. That same individual obtained the ribbon used in Bryce's murder. You may inform your men to locate the employee who visited my home 4 days ago from the bookbinder's firm of Hertz and Lyon. Kramer pulled out his pad. You sure you're not inventing this just to look clever? Inspector, Wolfe said dryly, I would not invent a trespass against myself. Even my imagination has limits. Kramer snorted but wrote it down. All right, I'll find your phantom bookbinder, and if he turns up with mistletoe in his pocket, you'll get the credit. When he left, Wolfe turned back to me. Archie, that parchment, have it photographed and transcribed. We shall examine its provenance tomorrow. Tonight, I wish to think. I nodded. Think about what? About how a piece of my house became a token of murder, he said softly. And about who had the nerve to pluck mistletoe in my garden of reason. He closed his eyes, his fingers steepled again, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying something like grim satisfaction. I knew that look. Wolfe had scented the path. Not all of it, but enough to know that whoever trespassed into the brownstone had stepped into his trap the moment they crossed the threshold. The next morning started with the kind of quiet that isn't peace. It's calculation. Wolfe didn't emerge for breakfast, which meant he was thinking or fuming, or both. Fritz tiptoed around the kitchen as if sound itself might be subpoenaed. At 11 sharp, the phone rang. It was Saul. I've got your bookbinder, he said without preamble. Name's Peter Holtz, works at Hertz and Lyon, just like Wolfe said. Except he hasn't been seen since Monday. His landlady says he cleared out 2 nights ago, left the rent paid through New Year's and no forwarding address. Which is about the same as a confession, I said. What else? He's got a record. Small-time forgery. A suspended sentence 5 years back. Made decent work of cleaning up. Until now. Until he made the mistake of freelancing for a corpse, I said. Thanks, Saul. Keep on him. If he's gone underground, dig shallow first. I hung up and went to report. Wolfe was already in the office, wearing his mustard-yellow house jacket and the face of a man who had anticipated the call. Holtz absconded. Like a cat from a bath, I said. He left his landlady smiling and the cops guessing. Saul says he's our fake bookbinder. Not fake, Wolfe corrected mildly. Merely corrupted. He entered my home under pretense, removed ribbon from the orchid rooms, and placed the parchment in that folio. His purpose remains opaque, but his hand is visible. Bryce's death clears some of the fog, I said. Holtz gives him the ribbon and the parchment, Bryce shows up at Mrs. Follis's dinner waving your good name, and somebody decides the mistletoe would look better around his neck. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. We must determine whose interest the parchment served. Marian Follis, her husband, or another of that company. That meant the day's schedule was written. At 10 minutes to noon, the first of the dinner guests arrived. Dr. Harold Cohn, all elbows and nervous blinking, the academic type who looks at chairs as if they might quiz him. Wolfe motioned him to sit. You knew Alton Bryce, Wolfe said. Professionally, Cohn said. He occasionally brought me early prints to verify. Most were genuine, though some less so. Did you attend the dinner willingly? I did. Mrs. Follis invited me. She hoped I might advise her about the exhibit Bryce proposed. I had my doubts. Wolfe's lids lowered. Doubts about the authenticity of the items, or the integrity of the man. Both, Cohn said, then swallowed. Bryce was charming but careless, and he hinted that he had powerful allies. I assumed he was lying. Did he mention my name? Cohn blinked rapidly. He said something about consulting you, only in jest, I thought. He seemed eager to appear connected. Eager men die early, Wolfe said dryly. That will be all, Doctor. Mr. Goodwin will see you out. As Cohn left, Wolfe muttered, He is irrelevant. His guilt lies in gullibility, not cunning. Next came Loretta Vale, the pianist, in fur-trimmed sleeves and a perfume that turned the air into a minor chord. She smiled at me as if we'd been formally introduced in another lifetime and took the chair opposite Wolfe with the poise of someone accustomed to scrutiny. I understand, she said lightly, that I'm being asked about murder before lunch. I'll try to be interesting. Do, Wolfe said. Your presence at that dinner, was it professional or social? Both, she said. Mrs. Follis's husband once sponsored a recital of mine. Alton Bryce thought music improved digestion. I obliged. You knew Bryce well? Enough to know he wasn't built for honesty. He borrowed charm like other men borrow money. Did he ever mention me? She tilted her head. Only that you disliked incompetence. He said he'd found something so important you would have to come to him. I laughed. I knew you wouldn't. Wolfe allowed the faintest curve of a lip. Quite right. Thank you, Miss Vale. Mr. Goodwin? She rose, brushing my sleeve as she passed. A deliberate accident. If you ever need help keeping him human, she murmured, call me. I'd need a symphony, I said, and she smiled her way out. Wolfe exhaled. A frivolous woman, but not a murderer. Her vanity is ornamental, not strategic. The final guest, Mrs. Zella Cogan, arrived wrapped in practicality. She ran the Follis building and had the personality of reinforced concrete. I told the police everything, she said before Wolfe could greet her. I'm not repeating it. Madam, Wolfe said, the police seek fact. I seek reason. It is less tedious. She frowned. Fine. Bryce was trouble. He came by the building twice last week asking for Mrs. Follis. Said he'd found something valuable, something that would clear her husband's slate. She refused to see him. Did she say why? She said she was finished with his games. I thought she meant gambling. He owed money to more people than I have tenants. Did you see him the night he died? No, she said. I left before dessert. Too much pretense. You could smell it. Thank you, Mrs. Cogan. You may go. When the door closed, Wolfe finally leaned back, a mountain settling after a quake. Archie, what is your impression? Bryce had leverage on the Follises, I said. Something big enough to make him cocky. He brought proof of it to dinner, probably that parchment. Whoever stood to lose the most silenced him. The question is whether it was to protect Jerome or to protect Marian. Both, Wolfe said quietly. Bryce intended extortion, using the parchment as his bludgeon, but I suspect he underestimated the intelligence of one and the desperation of the other. Before I could ask which was which, the phone rang again. Fritz answered, then entered, holding the receiver like a live grenade. "Inspector Kramer, sir." Wolfe waved a hand. "Put him through." Kramer's voice came sharp and fast. "We found your bookbinder, Wolfe. Holtz, or what's left of him, in the East River, wrapped in green silk. Same kind you described." Wolfe's eyes closed, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "How long?" "Dead about 48 hours, Kramer said. "Same method as Bryce. Strangulation. Somebody's cleaning house." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "And quite thoroughly." When he hung up, the room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I said, "That puts us down 2 suspects and 1 killer still at large." "Not at large," Wolfe said. "Merely unaware that I know them." He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the parchment lying on his desk. "Archie, have Saul return at once. Tonight we bait a trap, with knowledge as the lure and vanity as the snare." It was the closest thing Wolfe ever came to declaring war. That evening the brownstone was all low light and long silence, the kind of hush that feels like it's waiting for a door to open or a trap to spring. Fritz moved about quietly, setting up Wolfe's dinner, braised duck, white beans, the good beer. But I noticed the place setting for me had been left off. That meant business, not sociability. When Wolfe eats alone, it's not solitude, it's strategy. By the time I'd finished a sandwich in the kitchen and poured myself coffee, Saul had arrived. He was punctual as always, in a grey overcoat that looked like it had been pressed between 2 thoughts. He nodded to me, then to Wolfe, who was already seated behind the desk, his chair drawn close, the parchment on the blotter before him. "Saul," Wolfe said, "sit. I trust you've come unencumbered." "Always," Saul said. "You said this was delicate." "It is precise," Wolfe corrected. "We bait a snare tonight, not with deceit, but with knowledge. You will act as courier. A message must circulate to the right ears. Archie will ensure it reaches them." I sat down opposite. "A message to who?" "Kramer already has half the precinct chasing ghosts." "Ghosts," Wolfe said, "do not strangle bookbinders. We will reach those who breathe. Mr. and Mrs. Follis. Separately. Tomorrow morning a rumor will pass through their channels that the parchment found in my book contains not a forgery, but the genuine hand of Franklin himself. Furthermore, that I have deciphered its meaning and shall announce my conclusion publicly at noon." Saul's brow went up. "Publicly where?" "Here," Wolfe said simply. "In my office, with all parties present. The guilty cannot resist attending their own undoing." I said, "And Kramer?" "He will come uninvited," Wolfe said. "He is incapable of allowing me the last word." Saul gave one of his small nods, the kind that means, "Understood." "All right, I'll plant the rumor. Who's supposed to hear it first?" "Mrs. Cogan," Wolfe said. "She supervises proximity. She will tell Mr. Follis's assistant, who will tell him. Meanwhile, Archie will call upon Mrs. Follis and deliver a different truth." That got my attention. "What truth?" "That I have proof her husband engineered Bryce's death," Wolfe said calmly. "Not the final truth, merely a plausible one. It will produce the reaction we require." "Meaning I stir the pot while you hold the lid," I said. "Precisely," Wolfe murmured. "By morning, we will know which way the broth boils." It wasn't my favorite assignment, lying to a woman who looked like she could break from grief or rage, depending on which came first, but Wolfe's tone made argument unnecessary. Saul left within minutes, slipping into the cold with his collar up, carrying the seed of Wolfe's fiction to plant in the city's gossip soil. I took a cab to the Follis apartment just after 9. The doorman had instructions to announce no visitors, but money persuades even marble. He phoned up and after a pause, let me through. Marian Follis met me at the door in a robe of pale silk and a look that hadn't slept. The place smelled of coffee and lilies, neither of which I trusted. "You again," she said, but without annoyance. "Mr. Wolfe hasn't finished with us?" "Not quite," I said. "He asked me to deliver something privately. He thought it best you hear it from me before tomorrow." Her eyes flickered. "Tomorrow? Wolfe's calling a meeting at noon. Everyone who was at your dinner will be there. He intends to disclose what Bryce was carrying that night." Her hand gripped the door frame. "He knows?" "He knows enough," I said. "And he's convinced your husband arranged Bryce's visit and his death." The reaction was quick but not shocked. It was restraint fighting to stay decent. "My husband," she said slowly, "could arrange many unpleasant things, but not that. You're mistaken." "I'd love to be," I said. "Wolfe isn't often." She turned away, walking to the window. "Do you think I didn't wonder?" she said quietly. "Jerome's temper, his ambition, and Bryce knew too much about both. But murder?" She shook her head. "No, that isn't him." I let her talk, because sometimes people solve themselves if you leave enough silence. "Finally," she said, "what happens tomorrow? Wolfe will confront whoever took what wasn't theirs. If you're innocent, it'll clear you. If not—" I left the rest unspoken. She faced me again, eyes steady now. "Tell him I'll come." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was still awake in his chair, reading a volume on medieval ciphers as if it were a bedtime story. He glanced up. "Well?" "She'll be there," I said. "She's scared, but not of what she did, of what she might find out." "Good," Wolfe said. "Fear is instructive. And her husband. Probably getting his own version of the story from Mrs. Cogan by now." "Then," he said, "we wait." The night thickened. I poured myself a drink and sat across from him. He didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. At last he said, "Two men strangled with the same ribbon cannot be coincidence. Holtz was the artisan, Bryce the intermediary. The architect remains." "And tomorrow we meet the architect," I said. "Tomorrow," Wolfe replied, closing the book, "we meet folly disguised as intellect. It will be unpleasant but brief." He rose, signaling the end of discussion, and disappeared toward the elevator. I turned out the lights, leaving the office dark except for the glimmer of street lamp across the globe on Wolfe's desk. It looked, in that half-shadow, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for noon. By the time the city's clocks were striking 11:30 the next morning, the brownstone had all the quiet menace of a courtroom before the jury files in. Fritz had gone through the ritual of polishing the desk, straightening the chairs, and banishing the scent of breakfast. Wolfe sat motionless behind his desk in the yellow house jacket, eyes half closed, fingertips steepled, a mountain preparing to speak. I had the chairs arranged in their standard horseshoe, 6 of them, polished and waiting for tempers and lies. At 11:40 the bell rang. The first to arrive was Inspector Kramer, uninvited but inevitable, chewing a cigar that wasn't lit and glaring as if the case had personally ruined his Christmas. He growled at me, "You'd better tell your boss this circus ends today." And I told him I was counting on it. Next came Marian Follis, calm and pale, gloved hands, steady but eyes red from what I guessed had been an honest night of thinking too much. She nodded to Kramer, ignored his look, and took the seat Wolfe indicated with a faint gesture. Her husband entered moments later, brisk, expensive, and brittle. He didn't look at her. He gave Wolfe a curt nod, as if acknowledging another executive, then sat at the opposite end of the arc. Dr. Cohn, nervous as ever, slipped in with his hat still on until I plucked it from his head and parked him between them. Loretta Vale came last, stylish and scented, turning the tension into her own private stage. Mrs. Cogan followed on her heels, stiff-backed and wary. They made a picture: greed, pride, fear, and something darker running beneath. When everyone had found a seat, Wolfe opened his eyes and let his gaze move from face to face. The silence stretched long enough to make Kramer grunt. Finally, Wolfe said, "You all know why you are here. A man named Alton Bryce was murdered, strangled with green silk ribbon. Another man, Peter Holtz, followed him to the grave by the same method. The ribbon came from this house. The reason for both deaths lay in an old folio and a piece of parchment placed within it by deceit. The time for pretense has passed." Jerome Follis leaned forward. "You called us here to accuse me, I suppose." "I called you here," Wolfe said evenly, "to explain you." That earned him silence again. He continued, "Mr. Bryce intended extortion. He had obtained through Holtz a document, one that he claimed proved the authenticity of certain Franklin manuscripts you, Mr. Follis, sold for a fortune. They were counterfeit, of course, but the parchment's wording could have been twisted to imply that you knew of the forgery and profited by deceit. Bryce's plan was simple: offer to sell you silence. He told your wife the same, hoping to play one of you against the other, but he misjudged your household." Jerome's voice came clipped. "You have imagination, Wolfe. What proof?" "This," Wolfe said, nodding to me. I stepped forward and placed the photographed copy of the parchment on the desk. "The original is in safe hands. The phrase, 'truth preserved is fortune secured,' was Bryce's signal. He meant to make you pay for keeping your fortune intact." Marion's hands trembled once on her lap, then stilled. "So Bryce blackmailed Jerome?" "Then Jerome—" "No," Wolfe said softly. "He did not." Kramer barked. "Then who did, Wolfe? Let's have it before we all die of suspense." "In time," Wolfe said. "Bryce dined at your apartment, Mrs. Follis, with 5 potential witnesses. After dessert, he went into your study carrying that parchment. He had already failed with your husband. Now he hoped to enlist sympathy from you, to claim that Wolfe's property had been used in a forgery and that he was only trying to return it to its rightful owner. He was, as always, glib. But he miscalculated one listener, Mrs. Cogan." Every head turned toward the building manager. Her mouth tightened. "That's nonsense." Wolfe's tone stayed mild. "You told the police you left before dessert. That was a lie. You returned through the service entrance 20 minutes later. Bryce had already bragged about his scheme in your hearing earlier that evening, how he'd tricked collectors before, how he'd made money off your tenant's misplaced trust. You saw a chance to profit yourself, perhaps to force him to share his take. When he refused, you used the ribbon from his own pocket, meant for a festive flourish on the gift box he'd prepared, and strangled him. Then you took the parchment, believing it valuable, and fled." "That's absurd," she snapped, but color drained from her cheeks. "It would have ended there," Wolfe went on, "had you not gone one step further. You realized Bryce's associate Holtz might know your name, so you arranged to meet him, pretending to buy his silence. He met you on the riverside 2 nights later, and you ensured there would be no more talk." Kramer stood. "You've got proof of this, Wolfe, or I have logic," Wolfe said, "and evidence enough. The spool of ribbon Holtz stole from my orchids bore a single fingerprint in resin, a print matching the nail varnish worn by Mrs. Cogan. Fritz's microscope confirmed it this morning. She handled it before the murders, perhaps when tying up Bryce's gift. It was carelessness, but fatal." Mrs. Cogan's lips parted, then closed. She looked at her hands as if betrayed by them. The fight drained from her shoulders. "He was going to ruin me," she whispered. "He knew about the rents, the bribes. I only meant to frighten him, not—" Kramer's men were already moving before she finished. He gave Wolfe a grim nod. "You never fail to spoil my paperwork. All right, she'll get her due." When the room emptied and the echoes faded, only Marion remained, still seated, eyes lowered. Wolfe regarded her for a long moment. "Madame, you are exonerated. Your husband's sins are mercenary, not mortal. You will return to your home and close the door to vultures." She rose, murmured something that might have been thanks, and left with the quiet of a person who'd learned too much about survival. Kramer grumbled his farewell. "Someday, Wolfe, I'll beat you to it." "Unlikely," Wolfe said, not unkindly. When the door shut, the brownstone finally exhaled. Fritz appeared with beer, poured it with ceremony, and retreated. Wolfe lifted his glass and stared into the amber. "Archie," he said, "Christmas has proved again that goodwill is rarer than honesty." I leaned back in my chair. "Yeah, but it makes better headlines. You think she'll confess cleanly?" "She already has," he said, "to herself. That is the only confession that matters." He drank, eyes closing, content at last. The house was quiet again. No mistletoe, no trespass, only order restored. And as I turned out the lights, I figured it was about as close to a Merry Christmas as the brownstone was ever going to get. The day after Mrs. Cogan's arrest, the brownstone returned to what passes for calm in our line of work. Fritz hummed again in the kitchen. The orchids resumed being the only living things that got daily praise, and Wolfe sat behind his desk as if the whole affair had been an unpleasant advertisement for the folly of mankind. But if the surface was smooth, the undertow wasn't gone. I was typing up my notes for Kramer when Wolfe said, "Archie, the newspapers are crude." That was how he opened conversations he didn't want to have. "They're also enthusiastic," I said. "The Gazette calls it the Mistletoe Murders. Plural, mind you. I suppose 2 stranglings make a tradition." He grunted. "Sensationalism to justify ink. Have they distorted it?" "Only artistically. They've got you as the reclusive genius of West 35th Street, and me as your hard-boiled assistant with a heart of gold. Fritz gets one line about excellent cuisine. They even worked in the orchids." "I've endured worse libels," he said. "But the facts?" "Clean enough," I said. "Cogan strangled Bryce to stop him from blackmailing Follis, then Holtz to cover it. The police found the spool, the fingerprints, and the river doesn't argue back. It's airtight." Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands over his middle. "Airtight," he repeated, tasting the word. "You think me satisfied?" I looked up from the typewriter. "You mean you're not?" He closed his eyes briefly. "I am never satisfied when a thing concludes so neatly. Human motives seldom align with symmetry. Boss, you're saying the murderer confessed. The inspector's happy, the DA's salivating, and you're annoyed because it's too perfect?" "Exactly," he said. "Say, perfection in human affairs is counterfeit, like the manuscripts Mr. Follis sold." That was Wolfe's way of announcing he'd found a seam in the logic. "All right," I said. "What's the counterfeit part?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer and took out the photographed parchment. "This," he said, tapping the script. "Kramer believes it a prop in Bryce's extortion. Yet even false documents have authors. The question is, who wrote it?" "Holtz," I said. "He was the forger." Holtz copied handwriting. He did not invent riddles. Wolfe's tone had sharpened, which meant he was finally interested again. The phrase, "truth preserved is fortune secured," was not random. It has the cadence of a personal warning. For whom? For Follis. He shook his head. For Bryce. The parchment was bait. Someone handed it to him knowing he'd flaunt it. I leaned back, letting that percolate. "You're saying Cogan didn't act alone?" "I'm saying she may have strangled Bryce," Wolfe said, "but someone else placed the ribbon in her hands." Before I could argue, the bell rang. Fritz appeared with a card on a tray. Wolfe glanced at it, frowned, and handed it to me. "Jerome Follis," I read. He must have lost his appetite for staying out of headlines. "Admit him," Wolfe said. Jerome Follis entered looking like a man who'd survived his own scandal but hadn't forgiven the world for noticing. He declined a seat, which meant he was either nervous or theatrical. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, "I owe you an apology, perhaps. My wife insisted I come. She says you may have saved us both." Wolfe nodded slightly. "Your wife is perceptive." "I wanted to assure you," Follis continued, "that the sale in Chicago has been annulled. I've refunded the collector's payment. No further embarrassment will attach to your name or mine." "How conscientious," Wolfe murmured. "Though I wonder if your conscience extends to your ledger." Follis stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Wolfe said evenly, "that your manuscripts were forged long before Bryce entered your affairs. He was not the instigator, merely the irritant. The forgery originated with you." Color drained from Follis's face. "That's absurd." "No," Wolfe said. "It is arithmetic. You possessed the originals. You commissioned Holtz to restore them. You profited from their sale. When Bryce threatened exposure, you pretended outrage. You even permitted him to use my name to lend weight to his fiction. Convenient, as I had refused to authenticate them myself. When Mrs. Cogan killed him, she did so believing she was silencing a swindler. Your swindler. You let her hang herself with your ribbon, Mr. Follis." Follis took a step forward, face taut. "You can't prove that." "Nor need I," Wolfe said. "The law is content with one murderer, but you will live with the knowledge that you orchestrated 2 deaths through greed. My advice is to remain silent and abroad. America is inhospitable to those who sell its history." For a moment Follis said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply, turned, and walked out without another word. When the door closed, I said, "You just let him walk." "I did," Wolfe said. "Kramer has enough triumph for one season. The man's punishment will be exile. From respectability. Which isn't quite the same as prison," I muttered. "No," Wolfe agreed. "But prisons are finite. Shame is not." He reached for his beer, took a deliberate sip, and set the glass down. "Archie, telephone Mrs. Follis. Inform her that her husband has resolved his affairs and that she need not fear scandal. Then call the florist. Fritz insists on mistletoe for the kitchen. I will allow it this year." That one caught me off guard. "You? Mistletoe? You're sure the sight of it won't give you indigestion?" His eyes twinkled faintly. "On the contrary, it will remind me that folly, once recognized, can be contained." I grinned. "That's practically sentimental." "Pui," he said, but the corner of his mouth curved. "A rare indulgence. Do not expect it to recur." By evening the orchids were fed, the phone calls made, and the house at peace again. Wolfe took dinner in silence while I read the latest headlines aloud. "Bookman slays, forger found, millionaire cleared." When I finished, he said, "You see, Archie, truth preserved, fortune secured." The phrase was prophecy after all. And I said, "Maybe. But next time someone brings mistletoe into this house, I'm frisking them first." He grunted approval. Outside, the city glittered with winter lights. Inside, the brownstone settled back into its natural order, unchanged, except for the faint green sprig Fritz hung over the kitchen doorway, the only trace of murder left to decorate the season. The following morning brought snow, soft, deliberate flakes that fell the way time passes in Wolfe's world, without hurry, without apology. I stood by the window with coffee in hand, watching it pile on the iron railing, thinking how the city could look innocent when it wanted to. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, doing his morning ritual with the orchids, and Fritz was clattering in the kitchen, his mood improved by the weather, and by Wolfe's recent concession that mistletoe could exist under this roof without invoking doom. It had been 3 days since the case closed. Mrs. Cogan was safely installed where the state would decide how long her conscience should be confined. Kramer had dropped by yesterday to gloat and to complain, an act he performed with equal skill, before stomping out, muttering that Wolfe made justice feel like indigestion. As for Jerome Follis, the man had vanished from New York society faster than champagne at a debutante's ball. A note had arrived that morning, typed, unsigned, but with the faint scent of the cologne he'd worn in Wolfe's office. It said only, "Leaving for Europe tonight. My wife will stay. Consider my debt, moral and otherwise, paid." When Wolfe came down, he was freshly shaven, precise as a sermon. He lowered himself into his chair and waited for Fritz to appear with breakfast. After a moment, he said, "Archie, read the note again." I did. He listened with that detached calm that could freeze lava, then said, "A coward's farewell. It confirms what I already knew. The man cannot face the eyes of anyone who remembers the truth." "You could have turned him in," I said. "You let him walk." "I let him carry his shame unsupervised," Wolfe corrected. "That is punishment enough. Public disgrace is noisy and brief. Private guilt is efficient and eternal." "That's poetic," I said. "You getting soft?" "Pfui," he said, but his tone lacked venom. He reached for the newspaper I'd left folded on the stand and flicked it open with one finger. The headline still screamed, "The Mistletoe. Murders solved. Wolfe does it again." There was even a sketch of him, exaggerated enough to make him look like a thoughtful volcano. He studied it a moment, then set it aside. "The newspapers have yet to learn that attention is not tribute," he said. "Yeah," I said, "but they keep the lights on." "Only yours," he replied dryly. Fritz arrived with the trays, eggs, sausage, and hot biscuits that made the air smell like redemption. Wolfe began to eat with the slow precision of a man paying respects to civilization. I lit a cigarette and leaned back, feeling the rare calm that follows a case that hasn't ended with anyone shooting at me. When Wolfe finally spoke again, it was half to himself. "You see, Archie, even the smallest deception corrodes. Bryce sought profit through falsehood and met violence. Holtz copied deceit and was destroyed by it. Kogan believed she was silencing corruption and instead multiplied it. And Follis, he thought himself untouchable. Yet each in turn was undone by the same flaw, the belief that cleverness excuses dishonor." "Nice moral," I said. "You should embroider it on a pillow." He gave me a look. "The only thing suitable for embroidery is restraint, which you have never practiced." "Sure," I said, "but it keeps me entertaining." Fritz returned to clear the plates and, with the sly confidence of a man indulging a secret pleasure, hung a small sprig of mistletoe from the doorway of the dining room. Wolfe eyed it as though it might hiss. "Fritz," he said, "remove that abomination before it begins collecting dust." Fritz smiled, shaking his head. "No, sir, it stays for good luck. We have earned it." Wolfe harumphed, but didn't repeat the order. That alone was worth noting in the record books. After lunch, I took my coat to head out for errands. Kramer wanted a signed statement, and I needed fresh air after a week of murder and moral philosophy. As I pulled on my hat, Wolfe said, "Archie." "Yeah?" "If another client arrives uninvited, especially one bearing foliage, you will turn them away." "Even if it's Christmas?" "Especially if it's Christmas," he said. I grinned. "I'll tell them Nero Wolfe doesn't do holidays. Just justice." He sniffed. "Justice is merely logic applied to folly. It keeps the world tolerable." "That's a gloomy toast for the season," I said. "You could try peace on earth." He reached for his beer. "Peace," he said, "is for those who stop thinking." Then, after a pause, "and those who cook well." When the door shut behind me, the brownstone was quiet again, the way it likes to be. Just the faint hum of Fritz in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock, and the world outside wrapped in snow. Inside, Reason sat in its chair, fed and content, and if the faint glimmer of mistletoe caught the light above the doorway, Wolfe let it be. Because even in that house, under that roof of logic and order, something small and irrational had survived. Something like forgiveness, or maybe just the ghost of Christmas.